And hello, everyone, from wherever you are. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, I guess I'm calling it, of International Perspectives on Corpora for Language Learning. And this week we have our speaker tuning in from Northern Arizona University in the USA, Assistant Professor Tove Larsson, who's going to be presenting us a talk today on the perils of opaque measures and methods in corpus linguistics. We're very honored to have Tove with us, who's a rising star in the field of corpus linguistics and been doing some fantastic work over in Europe as well now in the US with colleagues including Jesse Egbert, Fiverr, and the NAU crew. And it's a real pleasure to have Tove with us today in this seminar. As with all public speaking events in Australia, I'd just like to begin our session with an acknowledgement of country, in which we acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet, paying our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we always recognize their valuable contributions to Australian society. As mentioned before, today's speaker is Dr. Tove Larsson, who is Assistant Professor of Applied Linguistics at Northern Arizona University and holds affiliations with Uppsala University in Sweden and the University of Louvain, Belgium. So two fantastic corpus schools right there. You can't get better training than that. She specializes in corpus linguistics, obviously, register variation and second language writing with a very keen interest in research methods. She's been widely published already in a very short space of time within IJCL, Corpus Linguistics, Linguistic Theory, Journal of English for Academic Purposes, and the very widely read and I think quite well cited already, Doing Linguistics with a Corpus book, which say, well, it's one of those element things, I think, isn't it? With Cambridge University Press together with Jesse Egbert and Doug Biver. So I'm going to hand over now to Tove, who's going to share her screen, and we'll take it from there. Thanks very much, Tove. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much to everyone who's here. Very happy to see you all. Let me start sharing here. Okay, so I'm gonna have to move people around a little bit here. So I'm gonna assume that you can see this, but let me know if you can't. Good. So yes, we're here right now in Arizona. It's March 7th. We're 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I saw in the chat that some of you are, here six in the morning and in the middle of the night and so on. So really, really appreciate that. And also know that it's actually March 8th for some of you. So I find time zones really interesting and somewhat confusing. So very happy to have you all here. Okay, so yes, I'll be talking about the perils of opaque measures and methods, and then how we can perhaps move toward increased transparency. Just a quick postcard before we start. So I'm currently in Flagstaff, Arizona at Northern Arizona University. Really beautiful area. Do come visit if you can. I spend a lot of time working for sure. And I also spend a lot of my time rock climbing, as it's a really nice area for that too. So the outline here, I'll start by just kind of generally setting the scene, talking about description versus prediction in corpus linguistics, and then turn to this main topic of linguistically interpretable versus opaque measures in the field. Then perhaps ask the question or support my thesis that it does matter to ask, okay, does it matter through this case study on syntactic complexity, and then some suggested ways forward. So linguistic description versus prediction. We can, of course, categorize different kinds of studies in different ways. And there are, macro level categories and micro level categories and so on. One that I find to be really helpful, for me at least, is this distinction between studies that have as their aim linguistic description versus studies that have as their aim to predict stuff, so predictive studies. And this is from, the terminology here is from Biber and colleagues in their G paper from 2020. Now return to what they mean here and what I mean here in the next slide or so. The thing here is that these have fundamentally different goals and methods, which is fine. We all have, some studies are focused on certain things and other focus on other things and so on. Just that with these being, I would claim, very, very different, they have very different research traditions and just purposes, really goals. And I think recognizing that is something that's really important for us as a field. And it's only problematic. So again, it's not problematic that there are different kinds of studies, right? That's exciting. That's means that we have a field that's very interesting and broad. But it does become a little bit problematic if there is a methodological mismatch, so that if one methods from one is used for the goals of the other, vice versa, and or if the goals are not identified as different. Again, I'm going to argue that they are. Very happy to discuss this in the Q&A, of course. So in this study, Doug Biber and his colleague talked about linguistic description as being studies that describe the characteristics of groups. So linguistic, it's fairly clear perhaps from the title itself, but so it describes something. We're looking at linguistic features, we're looking at linguistics. And in the process, then we distinguish among groups, but that's not kind of the main goal. So we can, compare how different groups, do and all that, but that's not kind of the main goal. And so they say that the primary focus of descriptive studies is the linguistic interpretation of specific linguistic characteristics. So interpretation is this keyword that I'll return to over and over throughout this talk. And then by contrast, predictive studies have as their goal to predict group differences, for example, different proficiency levels. It could be when, so just kind of automatically assigning grades to some automated tests and things like that, where it's about prediction. And just to be clear here, I'm not talking about the statistical methods used, although I guess some are more likely to be used in one research paradigm than the other. But so we can still use inferential statistics and so on in both of these, just that there are these methodological differences and also differences in terms of goal. And so the predictive studies then give little or no attention to the linguistic interpretation of omnibus measures, because such measures aren't designed to be linguistically interpretable. It's, it works. So, let's not, do anything really there. So if it works, it works. And again, I'm not saying anything that we shouldn't be doing this kinds of studies or anything like that, just that they have a slightly different focus. I'll be primarily in, or will, I guess, be primarily in this universe here, the linguistic description universe. And so whichever kind of path we choose here, what does it matter? How does it affect our measures and what we look at? So just to take an example from a project that I'm working on with some colleagues, some of whom are here today, stance adverbs. So we tend to look at stance adverbs in their own right. So, interestingly, clearly, and so on. We study them, we see, okay, how do people use them? Where in a clause do they occur relative to the verb? Do learners, look at learner data quite a bit, do learners use them differently from native speakers and so on? So we tend to focus on stance adverbs. We don't as much tend to use them as a means to study something else or to assess something else, although we certainly can. So they tend to be studied in their own right. in this linguistic description universe. And then we have things like T-units, which sure can also be studied in their own right, definitely, but more often they tend to be used as a means of studying or measuring something else in this predictive universe. So we say that, you know, maybe something like complexity, we're going to be returning to that, or something else that that the more T units something, right? Okay, so having set the scene a bit, so linguistically interpretable versus opaque measures, where when I say linguistically interpretable, this is what I mean. So I'm quoting here. So a measure is interpretable when its scale and values represent a real world language phenomenon that can be understood and explained, right? So one requirement here, there are others, is that all variables have clear operational definitions, which I'm sure if anyone who's ever done a study knows that, okay, this is something we really need to figure out before we can get started here. So something as simple, as easy as relative clauses, you know, might seem very straightforward, but is it really? And not necessarily, right? In part because there are different ways of defining it, but also in part that we need to decide what we mean by a relative clause. Do we mean only finite relative clauses? So the construction that was analyzed and so on, or do we mean both finite and non-finite? So the finding, discussed, and so on. So in this case, it's more about just making that decision, which one do we go for? And then we might want to then dig deeper and see exactly how we define it. And another study that I'm involved in here, where we're looking at spoken data, and we're trying to think about main clauses versus subordinate clauses and so on. Main clauses in writing tends to be fairly straightforward. Main clauses in spoken communication, less straightforward, right? Because we have so many incomplete clauses. What is that? It doesn't make it a subordinate clause. So, you know, what is it? Should we just exclude all those? Then we would be excluding 80% of our data and so on. Anyway, things for us to think about. So this is linguistically interpretable measures and what I mean by that. Then by contrast, we have opaque measures, which are not linguistically interpretable. And those are measures where the scale and values either tend to confound phenomena or don't represent real world language phenomena that could be understood and explained. So I'm setting this up as a dichotomy. So we have, you know, on the one hand, linguistically interpretable measures, on the other hand, opaque measures, right? You know, everything tends to be more of a continuum, and I think this is definitely one where, sure, we have things that are more linguistically interpretable and things that are less linguistically interpretable, more opaque. Frequency of adverbs, relatively straightforward once we have defined and operationalized and all that category. Then we count them and we see, okay, there are 4 adverbs in here and 3 of them are in position X and so on. On the opaque end, we have things like complex nominals, and I'll return to why I'm putting it in this category here in the case study. But then there are all these other things going on here too, right? So in the middle somewhere, we have things like means, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as an opaque measure necessarily. But if we think about the whole real world language phenomenon and so on, then let's say that we have a text with 2 adverbs, say, so 2 adverbs, and then another text with 3 adverbs, and another text with 2 adverbs, then, okay, the mean for across those texts would be something like 2.333, right? But we can't have a third of an adverb. So what does that really mean for us? So this whole, I'm still going to be thinking about it as a bit of a dichotomy, but let's keep in mind that it's somewhat simplified. Okay, so in the field, where do we get our measures from? And I know that I'm sure most of you, if not all, do these kinds of studies. So I know that I'm telling you things that you already know here. But so we, as corpus linguists, we tend to have a lot of data to work with. meaning that we tend to need tools of different kinds to help us process them. And that's fantastic. And I love, and I'm going to keep on saying this throughout the talk here, I love that there are people out there who put in the time to develop these tools that we can all use and make them, freely available, hopefully, or if not, then at least somewhat affordable. And that's really what we need for the field to run, right? To begin with, we have things like chord inserts, we have things like more advanced tools and so on that we all use at some point. And so we can use these existing software tools for our purposes, or we can develop our own programs if we have the skills for that. The thing though is that we tend as a field not very often to have the skills for that, perhaps, and myself included. I'm trying to learn to program, and I'm making progress and so on, but I still am nowhere near being able to develop these tools myself. So I rely on other people's work there. And as a field, we tend to rely very heavily on pre-existing software tools, meaning that these tools, whatever they are, right, and there are lots and lots of them out there, tend to have a strong influence on current research practices in our field, right? Meaning that we need to really be careful here and critically examine the results that they provide to make sure that it's what we want and what we're looking for, and depending on our paradigm and so on, what we need to be able to carry out our analysis. So it's of course really hard for any tool, whether you've constructed it yourself or if you're using someone else's tool, to achieve perfect accuracy, meaning that we can't just accept results at face value. We need to really think about this carefully and test and report precision and recall for the tools that we use. And also keep in mind, and this is something that I've recently started thinking more about, what does it mean, again, since I'm looking at a lot of learner language, where especially for kind of beginner level learners, that if I'm using a tagger, is it able to give me accurate results and so on, and also just even kind of before that, we don't tend to have errors be distributed randomly across all features. So if someone reports, okay, this tool is 89% accurate or something, or is it, let's say, a tagger, just to keep things simple here. So if it's 89% accurate, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that across all features, we have 80% accuracy as a recall or precision? And also, what about, maybe for modals, it's 99%, but maybe for some other auxiliary, it's, 34% and so on. So just, depending on what we want to look at, we want to make sure that we have a good sense of how accurate our results are from these automated tools. And this is, like I mentioned just before, even more important when we apply tools to data that they weren't developed for. So again, for most taggers tend to be developed on using first language data, so native speaker data. But what about second language data, especially really kind of basic levels? What does that mean really for the tool and so on? It's a really good study on this, comparing some different tools, Picarella et al. Okay, so accuracy is a threat to the validity of our results, yes, but, and I quote, perhaps the most serious risk to researchers using available tools is that many of the quantitative measures provided by corpus analysis software don't have transparent linguistic interpretations. So now I'm not talking about, concordisers and so on. Now I'm talking about other types of tools that help us, or are supposed to help us with the proper analysis and so on. And I'll return to that in the case study. And in some cases, these are measures that have no direct counterparts in linguistic theory. And in other cases, these are omnibus measures that collapse the use of multiple linguistic constructs into a single quantitative value. So again, I'm speaking from the perspective of this kind of descriptive framework here. So why does this matter? If we just, can use any tool for anything, right? Well, so of course, the choice that we make are going to have repercussions, right? But kind of taking it, like thinking it through all the way, is going to affect the results that we get, which is also kind of self-evident. But it's going to then have this most likely pretty big impact on the conclusions we draw, right? Meaning what our study is about and what other people think our study is about, meaning that we have an impact on the field with everything we put out there. The field hopefully then learns about it and is going to use those results to build on for future studies and so on, meaning that we're also influencing what practitioners, teachers, and so on do as well. So there's this chain of events, right, that start with us really as researchers. And yeah, so anyway, so yes, I spoiler, but I think this is really, really important. So I'm going to use a case study next here to illustrate some of the potential problems of relying on opaque measures that are automatically calculated using software. So this is a kind of behind the scenes view from a study that Henrik Kotteri, my colleague and friend, and I did, where we were definitely in the descriptive framework, but we used methods that were not from that framework, and we tried to make it work. And so this is just kind of our journey here, and to illustrate why it matters that we kind of keep track of where the methods come from and what they can help us with and what they can't help us with. Okay, so syntactic complexity. This is what the study was on. So syntactic complexity is defined as the addition of optional structural elements to simple phrases and clauses. And so if you're not familiar with it, just an example. So something would be more complex where you have a lot of pre-modification, post-modification. So there's a strong need for further high quality research into the association between the experience of stress across a variety of contexts versus there's a need for high quality research, for example. So when there's more things going on, there can be different kinds of complexity. We have, phrasal, causal, and so on. And so our study aim to investigate grammatical complexity in learner and expert writing from different registers. And we thought, okay, we're not, we don't have the skills necessary to be able to write our own program to be able to do this. Let's use an existing one. And then, so this is an actual study, right? It eventually got published, but this is kind of before anything happened that we include in the article. But so our first step was to use an automated tool to explore how the measures were patterned across registers and how they were used in learner writing. So from a descriptive perspective, what do we see? And we got results, right? We got this Excel sheet with all these numbers and we could run stats on them and we got results. And so we're like, okay, this is good, but what does it really mean, and why are we seeing the results that we see? And that's when we started running into trouble. So the program could not provide sufficient information for a detailed linguistic analysis of the results, and we just kind of realized that kind of as we were working on it. So that was a bit of a downer. And so we said, okay, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. What do we do? And so step 1.1 then was to use the online mode of this program, which allows for sentence by sentence tagging to try to see, okay, if we're on just one sentence, we might be able to kind of see where we get those numbers from, and if we change this little thing, then what happens, and so on. So we try to isolate the different measures and we try to decode the numeric scores that we got. But unfortunately, we had all these questions that we couldn't answer this way, in part because the measures themselves provided were proved to be challenging. And so I'm going to use one example here, so complex nominals per T unit, which, as it happened, turned out to be, or in our initial analysis there, turned out to be one of the most important predictor measures in our study. So we really needed to understand it, right, if we were to actually use these results. And I think in the future, I probably wouldn't have stuck to that initial method and just, try to make it work so badly. But we did, and we learned a lot from doing it. But just, so I'm sharing this experience here to to hopefully help other people. Okay, so complex nominals per T unit is an opaque measure, in my humble opinion here. So it's a ratio-based measure, which in and of itself is kind of hard in terms of linguistic interpretability or any kind of interpretability. And I'll return to that in some slides here. But even in isolation, the numerator, so complex nominals, and the denominator, T units, pose problems for the linguistic interpretability of the results. And I'll talk more about that now. So complex nominals is a measure that covers structures including noun plus adjectives, possessives, prepositional phrases, relative clauses, participles, appositives, nominal clauses, complement clauses controlled by verbs, gerunds, and infinitives when found in subject possession. So a lot going on here, right? So it confounds a lot of structural and syntactically distinct grammatical features. Again, keep in mind which universe we're in, right? Because it seems to work, right? So again, we found that this is a really important predictor. So in the predictive universe, great. In our universe, not so great, because is it the possessives or is it the relative clauses or is it the appositives or what's going on here, really? And so another issue for us in our study was that we saw when we did this exploratory analysis that the measure was actually dichotomous in that a noun phrase was coded as a complex nominal if it had any of the characteristics that were listed here. So it didn't really matter, how many of them per noun phrase and so on. So something like a green book was written in 1953, and the book, which is very interesting, was written in 1953, and the green book, which is very interesting, was written in 1953. All these three sentences have a score, a complex nominal score of 1. So we have pre-modification only in the first sentence in this complex noun phrase. We also have another noun phrase that's not complex here because it doesn't have anything going on there. So we have a sentence with only pre-modification, right? And then we have a sentence where the noun phrase only has post-modification, and then we have one with pre and post-modification, and they all get the same score. Again, it works, right? In that it's a good measure, it's a good predictor and so on. But for a descriptive purpose, we're confining a lot of different things here where we're not sure whether it's, or is it the pre-modification that's of interest? Is it post-modification? Is it both? Is it neither? And so on. So it doesn't distinguish between pre and post modification, which is a bit of an issue, or was an issue for us. And nor does it distinguish between single and multiple modification. And we have this label for it that complex nominals, which is useful to have a name rather than to have this long list of what it includes here. But it kind of suggests that it's a thing in a way that it isn't if you look in a grammar, for example, because all these different things that I listed are things in a grammar, but this is just this kind of umbrella term for things that happen in a noun phrase. And most relevant to us here is that it's nearly impossible to evaluate the actual linguistic basis of the measure as applied to specific texts, right? So we get the numbers, and we can run analysis. That's great. We can even publish, and and that's fine. But again, what are we really seeing here? And then T units. So arguably less problematic here. but still something that we want to maybe think about in this descriptive universe. So it's defined as one main clause plus any subordinate clauses or any subordinate clause or non-clause structure that is attached to or embedded in it. So we see this a lot, right? T units are everywhere really in our field and in neighboring fields. So the issue here is that T-unit measures conflate different structural and syntactic characteristics again. So again, we're not really sure what we're getting. It may work, but we're not sure exactly what it shows us. And so they're different or difficult to interpret linguistically. So I'm going to show you two sentences here and we'll kind of analyze them in the next slide here. So the first sentence, the thing that we often forget to think about was that the place where people made these interactions musically was out in the fields. And then we have something like, there's a need for further high quality research into the association between the experience of stress across a variety of contexts and miscarriage risk. Oh, and miscarriage risk. So miscarriage risk, yeah. So we have these two sentences here, and I've highlighted the verbs here, which shows us the clauses. So both of these sentences are a single T unit of the same length. And again, descriptively, we're looking at two very different things here. So in the first sentence, they're both authentic. So the first one comes from a spoken interview where you have one main clause and then four dependent clauses. So extensive clausal elaboration here. So a to complement clause, a that complement clause, and then two relative clauses. The second sentence, by contrast, is from a written news article. It has one main clause, so one T unit, and then a lot of prepositional phrases, a lot of embedding here. So phrasal compression, multiple phrasal noun modifiers, attributed adjectives, and pre-modifying nouns and post-modifying prepositional phrases and so on. So there's a lot of phrasal stuff going on here that we don't see in the first sentence, and yet we would get exactly the same score for both of these if we just were to look at a T unit and the length of a T unit and so on. Okay, so we talked about the numerator and then the denominator. Let's put them together in this one measure, and I understand that we need to normalize somehow, and so this is a way to do it. But just in terms of interpretability, again, we're in trouble, right? So it's a ratio-based measure, like I said, and in the previous few slides, I said how this is challenging in itself. Stay tuned. This is when we talk about that. So this is an amalgam of the individual scores from the numerator and the denominator, right? So complex nominals per T unit. So we need this kind of separate evaluation of the score for the number of complex nominals, and then also the score for the number of T units, where there's already a lot of things going on there that makes it hard to interpret linguistically. And so just to show you a thing that we ran into, Henrik and I, in our study, so we wanted to compare these two measures, complex nominals per T units versus complex nominals per clause, where you think that, okay, they would be fairly strongly correlated and so on. And they were in expert writing, where complex nominals per T units and complex nominals per clause were very strongly correlated. So 0.93, where one would be the max, so that are perfectly correlated. So yes, they were strongly correlated, meaning that they were similar in functionally similar. And yet we saw that the expert writers had a higher average ratio of complex nominals per clause than the learners, but there were only minimal differences between the learners and the experts for complex nominals per T units. And just kind of thinking that through, it took us a couple of weeks to just kind of, okay, what does that mean? So first of all, how is that possible, and why is it possible, and what does it mean? What's going on in the text such that we can have this happen? So this led us on to this mystery solving expedition, just trying to figure things out. So this is a bit of a long quote here, but I want to make sure to get it right. So we realized that, okay, one reason why we might see something like this could be due to the dependent clauses, right? So something's going on there. So because remember that a T unit is the main clause and then all these dependent clauses, right? So all things being equal, fewer dependent clauses in the expert data than in the learner data could possibly explain why the measures were strongly correlated in the expert data, as this would bring the scores for clause-based measures closer to those of T unit-based measures. So just writing the sentence took me, just like thinking through this enough to be able to write the sentence took me, a day. The thing was also that this wasn't actually the case. So, okay, scrap that. So we went back to the online mode of the program. We ran all this manual investigation stuff where we looked at the text and we tried to figure things out. And the kind of best thing we can think of that, again, after some weeks of just trying to make sense of this, was that it has something to do with the extent to which structures classified as complex nominals were dispersed evenly across clauses or not. So again, with T units, it doesn't really matter where in the T unit something occurs, because if it's per T unit, then it can be in the main clause, it could be in the dependent clause number 1, or and so on. Whereas if it's per clause, then it matters if you have 3 in one clause and 0 in one, and so on, or if we have 1 in each. So that was, kind of the best we could do there. And that seemed to be reasonable, and with the manual investigation and so on, that it seemed to make sense. But note though that we still didn't have this clear answer to the question of how the learners differed from the experts, because we had this measured complex nominals that, sure, we can figure out the T unit versus clause mystery, but we still have this complex nominal thing going where it just compounds all these linguistic structures that we're interested in our study. So what we did then to kind of try to make it less opaque was to carry out complementary manual, computational, and statistical analyses using some other tools too. And we found that the main differences between the experts and the learners was their use of prepositional and adjectival modifiers individually. So experts used a denser style of writing involving more complex noun phrases with pre and post modification, which is then in line with previous research. And we could go in and look, okay, what kinds of pre modification, what kinds of post modification, and so on. And also, the reason I'm not mentioning the name of the tool that we used is because I don't find it relevant here. It's in the publication, so we're not trying to hide it in any way. And again, we used a different tool then for this part too. So we used 2 different tools. Okay, so take-home messages from our study and also for us having done this. So trying to interpret results that stem from automatically calculated measures that are linguistically opaque is hard. It's cumbersome and a futile process in many ways, or in some cases at least. And so tools might be easy to use and give the appearance of having us carry out these sophisticated linguistic studies, but the measures provided are sometimes linguistically interpretable and can't really be evaluated for their linguistic accuracy unless you have access to the code and so on, which some tools give you. Okay, so some suggested ways forward here. So a concrete suggestion here would be to opt for a simple analysis if need be. I think my personal opinion is that as a field, we tend to get a little bit, and I've been guilty of this myself too, why I feel I can talk about it, is that we get kind of mesmerized by these advanced techniques and statistical techniques and so on. And that kind of pulls away from the focus on what we're actually here to do, study linguistics, right? And so so I'm in no way against statistics and so on, but I think there's a lot to be said for just calibrating the methods and the techniques that we have to our needs for that particular study. So yes, let's perhaps opt for a simple analysis if we can, with the primary goal of ensuring an accurate analysis that is directly interpretable relative to the linguistic research question of interest. And then just briefly returning to operational definitions for a moment here. So only with clear operation definitions can we reach higher inter and intra rate of agreement or reliability. So this is for manual investigation. I haven't talked about that much here, but it's not that, tools, pull us in this one direction, whatever. No, any kind of analysis requires these steps, right? So manual or not. And with clear operational definitions, can so with those we can obtain higher accuracy for our measures when it comes to computational tools, and thus draw more reliable conclusions from our findings. So it would be great if we as a field made sure to always measure and report things like inter-rater agreement, and measuring and reporting precision and recall, so accuracy, more than we are perhaps doing already. Some are great, but I think as a field in general, we can do better, including myself. So back to this why does it matter thing. So yes, the decisions that we make have these effects on the results and the conclusions and future studies and teachers and practitioners. We also have a possibility here, and where we as reviewers, as consumers, can make an impact here. So what are we putting our stamp of approval on? If a study is set up to be this descriptive study where you talk about how things need to be linguistically interpretable and so on, if the measures used aren't that, then let's hear it and so on. So in conclusion here, I would argue that opaque measures and methods may leave us unable to draw reliable conclusions even. So this is put fairly strongly here, but and again, happy to discuss this in the Q&A from our analysis. And so I would like to encourage us all to do our best to work toward increased linguistic interpretability, transparency, and rigorousness. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful talk. Lots of interesting points there for our audience, whether you're coming in from the research side of things. And I'm glad that we were also able to tie in the kind of focus of the talk for teachers and for educators as well, who may feel inclined to use tools, for example, things like cometrics or something which has been incredibly popular for a number of years. Tools like by Christopher Kyle, for example, even Biber's tagger, I suppose, because I guess we've got a little bit of a, well, I've got something to say about that in a moment, but I've been collecting some questions as we come in, but first of all, just thank you to Tove. I'm sure that everybody in the room appreciated that talk, and it's a bit difficult to give you applause or over this online format, but if you do just want to drop your thanks into the chat, that would be really nice for her. Now, we've got some questions and comments in from the audience, which I'm just taking a note of, and then we'll get straight into those. So we'll begin with a question from Lawrence Anthony, who asks, can you explain why the frequency of adverbs is something that is linguistically interpretable? Isn't frequency almost impossible to interpret linguistically?
Interesting.
Have I got that right, Lawrence? Or maybe
that's right. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So
I could just make just add a comment to that. For example, if you say something 2 times, what does that mean linguistically compared to saying it once? If you use an adverb once or use an adverb twice, how can you interpret that linguistically? I feel that frequency isn't something that is a linguistic phenomenon.
So, and you're right. I think for my example with adverbs there, I think it's more to do with the kind of the real world application, or the real world, does it exist in the real world, yes or no kind of thing, where a complex nominal, so, okay, does it exist in a grammar, I guess, because what is the real world? Is a grammar really part of it? Where an adverb, assuming we've defined it, we can see, okay, this is an adverb, interestingly, or whatever adverb we're interested in, we can say yes, and then we do, one, and so on. And then, whereas means 0.33 adverbs doesn't exist in the real world, in that we can't do fractions of an adverb and so on. What would that look like? But you're right that I think anytime we count stuff, we abstract away from it for sure, and because it represents something else, so we've added a layer. So I think that's a really good point.
So basically you're saying that the adverb aspect is linguistically interpretable, but not necessarily the frequency of the adverb. Whereas with complex nominals, the concept of complex nominal is not linguistically interpretable.
Correct. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. I've got a question from Diego, or sorry, Daigo, I believe his name is. He mentioned one can be attracted to complex analyses when doing research. What other factors do you think can lead us to opaque measures, and what can we do to avoid it?
I love that question, and I think that's something for all of us to think about. I don't have a good answer there, other than to say that I think we, the way where the field is moving in terms of, again, this preference for advanced statistical methods and so on, I think we're being in a way pushed in the direction of advanced analyses and so on, where because if we don't, then we have reviewers saying, well, you should have done this, you should have done that, and so on. And I think that could be interpreted to mean that we should always be doing these advanced things and so on, not that we should be doing these advanced things when they're required, like when we really need to understand our data and so on. But I would very much love to hear from you all what you think is the answer to Diego's question there.
While you're thinking about the answer to Diego's question, I guess my comment is that, I mean, it's interesting for me to have both yourself and Jesse Egbert, for example, it's almost like if you read the history of the work that has come out of your school, in terms of like Doug Biber's contributions and Staples and so on, where you made careers almost off these very complex analyses, converting these variables into, running factor analyses on them, turning them into dimensions, and then comparing the dimensions across text and then saying this is the answer. And it's almost like, in a way, and I'm not just mentioning like kind of Biber colleagues, but like McNamara and Christopher Kyle, who's the other one that names just suddenly escaped me, but there's whole areas, whole teams who've done this for their whole careers, and it seems like very interesting for me now to see publications like Doing Linguistics with a Corpus, and then in your talk today to basically, Scott Crossley, that's right, thank you very much, Nafal, that's the name I'm thinking of. For now, the people like yourself to be coming in and saying, now hang on a minute, we've been doing that for years, but now it's suddenly time to actually think about, oh, well, maybe was that the right thing to do, and were we using the right measures all along? And what's kind of sparked this discussion, or have I been interpreting things wrong all this time? What's your take on that? Just thinking about the history of the school where you work and what the kind of analyses that they were famous for. And now, again, with your talk today, and I think you're absolutely right on the money, but it just seems like a 180 from a lot of the analyses that were being carried out before. What's your take on that?
Sure, and I thank you for bringing this up, because I think Jesse Egbert, Doug Biber, and I have gotten this quite a bit where people say, wait, aren't you contradicting yourselves here? And and at first we're like, no, and we couldn't really, but I think we've had to think about that a bit more. And I think the short answer to that is that I guess all three of us, but I'm just going to be speaking for myself here now, but would be in favor of minimally sufficient methods, meaning that don't go any more fancy than you need. So that if factor analysis, which is the kind of the engine of multidimensional analysis, which like you pointed out, Peter, is what Doug Weber has done or spent a lot of his career using as a method, is a very advanced method, right? At the same time, to try to make sense of all the data that Doug wanted to make sense of, that was kind of what was needed, in that it abstracts away from the data for a bit, but then it returns to it, and we can see, okay, so we have all these dimensions, right? But what are those dimensions made up of? We can look at individual features and say, okay, well, it's a lot of high frequencies of personal pronouns and mental verbs, and so it's not about we just kind of go off into this universe where there's only numbers and stay there. We return to the text, we can interpret it, and so on.
That's something that I think that they've always done well in all of the books and the papers I've read. Is yes, you do have these incredibly complex measures, and but they always do bring it back to the text. So I think that's something that is very commendable. But then you don't see that in some other research, right? Which I guess is the point that you're trying to make.
Yeah, and also for me, coming from a very so quantitative, but a very kind of manual investigation type of background, I am struggling a little bit with taggers to begin with, where I'm like, oh, wait, how do we know that this is actually what we want to do, and accuracy and all that. But on the other hand, the alternative to that is manual investigation, where you go in and you look yourself and you categorize, and having now been involved in several projects where we're have multiple coders and we're testing for inter and intra and reliability and all that, we see that that's not perfect either. So I think it's really interesting for us as a field, again, to be thinking about, what are we trusting, right? So are we trusting ourselves, fallible humans? Are we trusting tools which are, I guess, made by fallible humans, but then very likely to be, or they're going to be consistent, right? So that whatever you do is going to do the same thing every time, because computers are consistent. So there's going to be issues involved everywhere there. And I think maybe in the past, and I realized that I don't have a really long history myself in the field, but in the time that I've been here, I think we've just kind of taken things at face value, and just we've been just happy to accept things, and as reviewers and so on, we're like, okay, they did an analysis, and like, okay, what were some problematic cases and things like that. So I think we can do better, again, as a field, myself included, explaining and being transparent and sharing our coding scheme, sharing our data, sharing to the extent we can, and sharing just everything to just push ourselves to be as rigorous as we can possibly be. And just very briefly, and sorry to be answering a question that you didn't really ask here, but we want to make sure that if we find ourselves in a position where we really need these really advanced methods, statistical methods and otherwise, then we want to make sure that we explain it really well, that we do return to the language, that we do kind of remember our identities as linguists rather than as anything else, computer scientists or statisticians or whatever, that we're trained as linguists, and that's kind of our main focus. So that's something that I feel very strongly about. But again, I love to hear everyone else's view on this too, of course.
I think that's come across in the work that you've been doing recently, that we are linguists, and that at the end of the day, despite all of the wonderful techniques and stuff available to us, we are still doing linguistic analysis, and that's really important. Okay, I do have some other questions that have just come in. So I've got a question from Nafal Hostens. how would you suggest approaching the interpretation of prediction-based analyses, for example, classification tasks, since these tend to be more successful with opaque measures?
So I chose not to spend a lot of time on that in this talk. The main reason for that is that I don't know all that much about that world. So again, I'm not speaking ill of it. I know that there's so much good work done in that field, or that subfield, or whatever you want to call it. So I guess I don't have an answer there. Just that things are going really well. The problem, as I see it, is when we're kind of mixing, like I mentioned early on in the talk, when we're using methods that kind of belong in this other universe and we try to apply it to our universe, and vice versa, and so on.
Question then from Imane Bufaden. Apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly. But the question is, what are the parameters that you rely on to decide whether something is a complex nominal or not? And as a sub-question, have you thought about taking the kind of topic that you mentioned today and turning that on other fields, for example, social studies, psychology, for example, where these kind of opaque measures are embedded into the field? I think that's what the question was. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. You can pop in on the chat to correct me.
Sure, thank you. So in terms of complex nominals, so the measure is defined in publications, right? So I cited one here, but there are publications that kind of describe what's included. I guess the issue is that for a descriptive approach is that there's a lot of stuff kind of in this measure, right? So like I had this slide where I listed, positives and pre-post modification of different kinds and so on. So the issue for descriptive studies is that we don't really know what's doing what, right? Is it the pre-modification? Is it the post-modification? Is it the positives? Is it, what's going on there? Where if you're just going to use it for prediction, it doesn't perhaps really matter because it works, right? So it's a good predictor of something. So, great. So the problem was when we imported it into this descriptive universe, we just had no way of understanding exactly what it does in great enough detail for our purposes, right? And in terms of the second part of the question, sure, I think, there's we have a lot of neighboring fields that do similar types of analyses that we do in some subfields of corpus linguistics and neighboring fields, and where again the purpose is not to look at language, right? To look at do detailed linguistic analysis and so on, and the measures work, go for it. This might have taken people 40 years to develop this measure that accurately predicts X. Great, I'm not against that at all. Just that for our purposes, when we're looking at the language itself and so on, it just wasn't detailed enough.
Thank you. Got a question from Lydia Amrani, who's asking about phrasal complexity use. She's doing a study on L1, L2 academic writing using corpus methods. She asked, is there a way to extract prepositional phrases from corpora using corpus linguistic tools?
Sure. So a lot of different tools and taggers have that option for sure. And so we ended up using one of Chris Kyle's tools in the end, Task, and that allowed us to look at the prepositional phrases and so on, and specifically the Viber tagger, which is going to be made freely available sometime soon here, also allows for that and so on. So there are definitely tools, just that the one that we started with did not have that option for us.
Okay. Another question from Lawrence. Would you say keywords are linguistically interpretable?
What do you think, Lawrence?
It's kind of I would say yes, in that they're just words with a statistical preference for being in one corpus over another, but they're still words, aren't they?
I would say they're not interpretable.
Okay. Well, then, what's your hot take?
It comes back. It's kind of. I'm thinking about that comment earlier about frequency not being interpretable. I think if frequency is not interpretable, then keywords are based on frequency, so they're not interpretable either. So the fact that a word is frequent in one unusually frequent in one corpus compared with another. I've seen, actually, I just read Václav Brezina's interpretation of keywords being they characterize the corpus. That's one interpretation of them, but I don't think keywords are characteristic of a corpus, because we can have a keyword which based on the fact that it appears twice in one corpus and once in another corpus. It's unusually frequent in one compared to the other, but linguistically it's irrelevant. It's just noise. So
yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, no, I don't disagree there at all. And I think we might want to, though, think about interpretability as being more of the scale from more to less and so on. So I wouldn't say that they're completely impossible to or not interpretable at all, but sure. And also, what does it even mean? Like you said, you might have 2 versus 1. Is that really, characteristic of that corpus? And also kind of remembering that, we have just a corpus. What is that really? What can we generalize to? Are we looking at the English language, or are we looking at the B and C, which it's made up of?
Yeah.
And so on. So yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. What do we mean? Because I think and how do we, like, what conclusions do we draw based on it, and what do we mean to begin with? So I like that. Thanks.
I would just to follow on from what you're just saying there. I think if you use a keyword approach, then you would probably want to introduce some kind of thresholds on raw frequency and so on, and range, and so on, just to make sure that the keyword is a legitimate keyword, a linguistically interpretable keyword, rather than just take the top 100 for whatever reason.
For sure. And then we have dispersion too, which is built into some, including yours, and so on. That makes makes a difference too in terms of how we interpret it. And no, for sure.
I made a comment just earlier about this, about complex nominals. If you look at the chat, you'll see it there. But the main problem I see with that is the fact that when you do count complex nominals, 2 complex nominals is not necessarily more complex than 1 complex nominal. I think that's where the real problem lies, because the definition allows for multiple complexities to be counted as 1.
Yes.
So 2 is not necessarily more complex than 1, and therefore you can't use this as a variable, because it's impossible to interpret.
That's right.
Thanks.
I guess the little comment here from Agnieszka, what if we replace the term linguistically interpretable with intuitively comprehensible?
Interesting. I would like to keep linguistically in there, but maybe linguistically, intuitively interpretable.
I mean, I got this. I got just a follow question. Because we're in Australia, we deal a lot with systemic functional linguistics people, and I even have PhD students who are doing corpus studies using, say, appraisal and that kind of thing. And when I see these categories, and we're doing corpus studies comparing these categories across data, but for me, these are like the opposite of linguistically interpretable. It's almost like just that's your opinion of what it is, and that's how it gets labeled. And it's very rarely broken down into actual units and things like that. So are you saying that maybe those kind of studies are doomed to failure from the outset?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, maybe I'm just, let's all be friends kind of person, but I think it's important to keep in mind what tradition we're working in and from. And so that, again, for some kinds of studies, these kinds of measures that did not work at all here would work really well, right? So I think it's really important to keep in mind what our goals are and what our research questions are, I guess, and try to use the methods that work best for those. But sure, I mean, I think it's easy for us to, and myself included, when you go to a conference or something, you're like, yeah, maybe not, but I think it does make sense if you kind of walk in someone else's shoes and say, okay, you're interested in this. Well, okay, I get it. That's not what I'm interested in, but
I got it. Okay, we're going to finish off with a question from Martin, which is a very general question I think everyone will appreciate. Do you have some tips for early career researchers about how to be rigorous and still be competitive in our publish and perish world? Do you think there's a conflict between increasing demands for transparency, open science, and this kind of methodological push in applied linguistics, and being able to actually do such projects as an early career researcher who needs to publish, say, 5 papers a year? And I think it's a really valid question. And I also get the feeling sometimes, and I'm no longer in this position myself, but when you hear a lot of this talk from the powers that be saying, oh no, you shouldn't be doing it like this, and even though people have been doing it like this for years, you're kind of like, well, people have done very well out of doing that. And if I want my career to progress, I'm supposed to be following these people. Now I've got this other person saying, oh no, don't do it like that, do it like this. And I understand that's what science is, but it does, for early career researchers, it is a real minefield. And I think it's an excellent question. And as I guess you still count as an early career researcher yourself, how have you managed this push towards this methodological turn in applied linguistics and the demands on early career researchers that this places?
Thank you. Yeah, this is an excellent question, and one that I hope that we can keep talking about as a field more and more. I think for me, we have a responsibility toward ourselves and toward the field not to put out things that we're not proud of. And what I mean by that is things that are not rigorous, so that we're not, we feel that, okay, we could have done better here. I'm not saying let's all be, complete perfectionists, but I'm saying let's not put stuff out just to put stuff out. Yes, it is, some people make a career of that, but I don't think that's the kind of field that we want, where we're flooded by studies that really shouldn't perhaps be out there. So I think for me at least, and I'm not saying that my work is perfect in any way, but I try my very, very best to never send something off that I'm not happy with. And that means that there are studies that I've completed and never submitted because I just felt that, okay, this is not who I am as a researcher and what I want out there for the field to build on and so on. In terms of the pressure to publish and the pressure to really just, quantity and all that, I understand that's a reality, and it is, certainly here too. I would say my best advice would be to collaborate with people, because if every study is just you and your analysis and like that's A, very time consuming, and B, it's not going to be as good a study as if you're working with someone else, because 2 brains are smarter than 1 brain and so on. It also means that you can divide up the work a bit and maybe divide up some of the writing and so on. I think that could be a way to still have like really good, rigorous work out there, but where you don't have to have written every single word, and you don't have to have done every single part of the analysis and so on. And it's more fun too to work with people. So
I think we all agree with that. And I mean, I've got hopefully it's in the second round of revisions, but we've got this bibliometric study of corpus linguistics fields, and includes the most productive and most cited authors in corpus linguistics. And if you look at the top 10, top 20, it's all people who've worked in these big teams like Jesse and myself, who used to work with Ken Highland, for example. People who they all always publish together, and that's what raises the number of publications and then the number of citations as a result. So definitely collaboration is key. We've got the internet. We can work with people around the world. We can have talks at any time of the day, which is what we've done today. And I also really like your comment there about not to submit work that you're not happy with. I think I'm guilty of doing that in the past. And there's papers that I do have out there that I wish I could just self-retract, I suppose, based on what I've done. But yeah, maybe for the foreseeable future, don't submit something that you're not happy with. I think it's a really good take-home message. Okay, we've troubled you for long enough, Tove, and I think the discussion has been really useful. The recording will be available soon So do look out for that, probably within a few hours' time. I just want to bring everybody's attention just before we leave to the next speaker. So I'm just going to share my screen here. We've got